the barrier of infinity versus the infinite rotation, Gojo versus Johnny Joestar. In recent memory, I don't think there has been a matchup like this in a very, very long time, involving two characters who deal with a lot of physics-based abilities clashing against each other, basically symbolizing the immovable object versus the unstoppable force. It's personally one of my favorite reasons why I like to do versus videos when it comes to two characters that symbolize each. So with all that preamble out of the way, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. However, since this is a JJK video and I don't know everything about the JJK verse, yet again I have brought Ronin on to speak with me on this topic.
Yo, happy to be on the channel once more, here to talk about a JJK and JoJo's topic where apparently, so I've been told, Gojo doesn't just get absolutely mopped up. You know, I'm excited to be here, maybe represent for JJK for once in a cross-verse battle.
I think immediately going into this, I have to explain Johnny, because I feel like even partially with me, I've kind of misconstrued people. Steel Ball Run, at least in recent years, at least with me when I scale it, or just their universe in general within that continuity of JoJo's, doesn't have a lot of good feats, which is honestly giving Gojo a pretty massive advantage here. So for Johnny scaling, we're not going to talk about Act 1. Act 1 is basically a nothing burger. It really doesn't do anything in this fight. It's just Johnny spinning his nails at his opponent that really don't equate to anything because he's not actually properly using the spin here. He's just spinning it. So when it comes to Act 2 with Johnny is basically his default. This is kind of his bread and butter. There's nothing really past this that he uses consistently a lot because shockingly enough, Act 3 has less showings than Act 4, which is kind of wild. So for the most part, Act 2 has the ability to shoot a bullet much better than Act 1, but it has the ability to track any enemy that Johnny faces. And once it makes contact with said person or entity or even object, said object will spiral into the infinite spinning of the golden rotation for a few seconds, destroying vital organs or shredding it into Swiss cheese basically. Now you could say, at least in this case and maybe the others applicable higher than Act 2, might just negate durability in general, as the spin has the ability to manipulate the human body to a pretty high degree. But when it comes to Act 3, things change pretty drastically here. Johnny goes from understanding the spin to basically surpassing it, quoting from Gyro Zappelli, who is the best spin user within the Steel Ball Run universe, who then goes on to say that Johnny has surpassed anything his family has ever made involving the spin. Its ability is when Johnny shoots himself with a bullet, he's able to enter the bullet hole itself, which is called a special dimension or a dimension separate of the main universe that he's currently inhabiting. While in it, he can move in any direction, placing any of his limbs outside of it to shoot from anywhere. And if anybody were to make contact with the bullet, like trying to physically get inside it like Johnny, their body would instantly dissolve, as they don't meet the specifications of what Johnny was doing previous with the golden rotation. Basically meaning it's vaguely a one-shot ability if applied like that. However, it mainly still functions like Act 2 for the most part. However, looking at some of the stand stat details, its ability is also described as wormhole-like, kind of implying the fact that it might be able to travel anywhere or give the ability for Johnny to show up in one place and then a completely different one that might be hard to achieve, like maybe crossing into a different dimension, as the wormhole implication implies real-life physics that imply that Johnny could travel massive distances in a very short time. Now let's talk about Act 4, the infinite rotation. While Johnny rides a perfectly healthy horse in sync with its running, Johnny can shoot out the spin in combination with the golden rotation to shoot out a super spin, aka the infinite rotation, that being Act 4. Tusk at this level has the ability to pierce through any barrier because the bullet has infinite energy, and it's not like some hyperbole or like anything like that. It's just straight up infinite punching power, which might not be infinite because it might be greater looking at how it's related to the other abilities previous to its showing, that being D4C Love Train and Ball Breaker. D4C Love Train's ability was able to redirect misfortune across the world at any point in time and or the infinite multiverse at any point in time. Funny Valentine basically became became an unmovable object. And Gyro speculated using the super spin and ball breaker, he could beat D4C Love Train's light barrier, which was redirecting all the misfortune, and pierce through it to kill Valentine. However, the horse was off and that didn't happen. However, when Johnny did it, Valentine straight up said, I think this is what Gyro was going to do, but this seems even stronger than what Gyro was even planning. So you're looking at an ability several times more powerful than the power to redirect misfortune across the infinite multiverse. Extremely powerful, but of course it does have a drawback. You have to have a healthy horse and kind of the proper conditions to actually shoot this thing off. So either being kicked by the horse or riding on the horse in sync allows Johnny to use Tusk Act 4 and its infinite rotation. So overall, in terms of hacks and abilities, Johnny is overpowered. However, this is where we get into the funny area. Johnny's scaling is, well, iffy, and overall Steel Ball Run scaling is even iffier. While there is a few feats that kind of confirm Johnny being at least building to small building level, thanks to Tusk Act 4 being able to rip open basically anything that's in front of him, in terms of speed, he is really slow. He's being tagged by bullets constantly throughout this part. Where it gets funny though is with Diego from the alternative world. Some people interpret the fact that since there are two worlds, they have to be the same, which would imply a lot because then we have to go into part 3 scaling, and I'll just throw it up on screen, but more or less Dio and Jotaro are basically the same, and since that is the case, Dio and Diego would also be the same. So you're looking at like island level to mountain level in terms of AP and durability, and in terms of speed, thanks to stand stat guides and general scaling within part 3, you're looking at characters being massively faster than like Plus. And since Tusk Act 4 has some really good showings against Diego and his version of the world, a lot of people equate to Johnny having very similar scaling to Dio and Jotaro from part 3. However, there is an association fallacy here. Diego and Dio are not the same character. Even though they have the same ability, they might not be the same. Within an infinite multiverse of you, there will be weaker versions of you and stronger versions of you. And since we don't really get a lot in terms of showings here with Diego and his versions of the world, you can say it's not really fair to compare them and to use that scaling. However, there is the other side of the argument where you say that Araki actually is implying that this is supposed to be a callback to part 3, so you might take it at face value and say like it's supposed to be quite literally the world bar for bar. So you can have two interpretations of Johnny's scaling where he's lowballed and is just really superhuman like, or is basically on the same level as part 3 Stardust Crusader, Jotaro, and Dio. At bare minimum, what you can take from that fight though is that in terms of speed for Tusk Act 4 by itself, unrelated to Johnny, is that he's maybe in that incalculable speed because he broke the speed formula while moving in frozen time, depending on your interpretation of how time freeze works within JoJo's.
Yeah, so for Gojo's scaling, it's honestly pretty simple. There's a couple of different levels you can attribute to Gojo, depending on how you view JJK scaling in general. You can sort of get the like really low-balled scaling for him, where you have his speed being like mildly faster than that of sound. You can get that just from characters like Shoso shooting piercing blood, characters like Sukuna absolutely blitzing that. You even have characters like early Shibuya Yuji being able to react to and block that rather successfully. Obviously, Gojo exists as the pinnacle of the verse, not only in terms of overall abilities as a sorcerer, but also statistically, really only being rivaled by the likes of Sukuna. We see during the Sukuna raid that he's capable of dodging piercing blood and moving much faster and a much farther distance than it is able to when given that same context, which even if you lowball it to the greatest extent, you say now you really capped the story off at Mach 3, right? For the sake of this battle, apparently it doesn't really matter, you know what I mean? Johnny ain't gonna be moving too fast on his own. You have higher levels of scaling, of course, you can get them into that like several times faster than sound, or even like lightning timers if you're, you know, a big proponent of the whole Kashimo cursed energy, Hikari reacting to that sort of argument. I've seen some light speed arguments for Sukuna reacting to Kashimo's sort of electromagnetic waves. However, the issue with that is that the feat itself is displayed too ambiguously to determine whether or not Sukuna is dodging the attack as it's happening, or if he is simply reacting to Kashimo charging it. Either way, speed is not going to be an issue here. Gojo ranges from either like a bare minimum, you know, being able to quite easily react to bullets, react to something traveling faster than sound, etc., many times over, blitzing those level of characters and and above. So I mean, you're gonna have him be like from that speed of sound to several times the speed of sound range pretty comfortably without too much contention there. Attack potency wise, it gets maybe a little bit more contentious for people. You have feats like Jogo using maximum meteor, and that's been calced out to be like city block level, which is on the low end for calcs. You have Ishigori's Granite Blast, which is calced to be like a large town level feat. You have Gojo being able to power like an entire country on his own with his own cursed energy. At least, you know, it's stated that that could be the case. It's not directly ever shown, but it is said that due to Gojo's use of the infinity, or rather his use of cursed energy in the six eyes, he'd be able to power a country over time. That's been calculated to be like a small city level feat. If you go off of domain scaling, characters like Jogo and Dagon are capable of creating mountains and islands respectively, which would obviously boost Gojo's physical power and his ability to use his curse techniques like blue, red, and purple all that much more. However, once again, even lowballing Gojo here, his bare minimum offensive ability would be able to get the job done. Now, when it comes to Gojo scaling and it comes to having him in fights like these, it's pretty obvious that his physical abilities, his physical tools, his speed, his durability, his strength, those aren't the things that you put Gojo in a versus battle for. What you really do it for is the limitless and all of the abilities that come with that, namely infinity, as we've been alluding to over and over and over. Now, we'll talk about the specific mathematical applications of infinity and how that deals with other abilities that sort of warp, manipulate, or just directly bypass spatial manipulation altogether. But all you need to know in a general sense is that Gojo takes space, divides it infinitely, makes it so that as you travel towards him, you get slower and slower, and that basically you slow down to a point at which you will never hit him. Very simple concept. You could simplify that even further. Barrier that generally nothing can bypass. Now, we've seen things get past it. For example, if you have the ability to just outright negate curse techniques like Toji with the inverted spear of heaven, Jogo and Hanami, as well as Sukuna with domain amplification, or if you're someone like Sukuna and is able to attack not, you know, Gojo or infinity itself, but literally the space that he inhabits, then you're sort of able to get around the technique in a very rock beats scissors sort of way. Rather than attacking it outright, you're kind of bypassing the function in which it works at altogether. Now, there is another aspect of the ability that makes it so strong, namely being the six eyes. The six eyes allows him to manipulate space on an atomic level. This has been stated in volume 0 by Miguel. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. One, it means that the level of which he's able to manipulate it is known, and two, that means that we're able to basically decide what that limit is based on the statement. Anything that is less viable than like a literal atom, say like a subatomic particle, like a photon, light, for example, would be able to bypass infinity, because while the six eyes is very perceptive, like down to the atoms is about where that limits out. That will be something that I'm going to be referencing when talking about how Gojo's abilities go up against, you know, Tusk's Act, particularly 3 and 4. Now, he has another ability that's really useful. It's not necessarily the end all be all in this specific fight, but Infinite Void is sort of like his main win con against a lot of characters, even if they're stronger than him. He catches you in the domain and you're imbued with an infinite amount of information that absolutely just fries your brain. And even if you don't die from the overload of information, which we do know that characters not really used to protecting themselves, non-sorcerers or cursed spirits, will just immediately die. Even characters like Sukuna take massive brain damage from being caught in Infinite Void for only 10 seconds. So Johnny, someone who doesn't have the greatest durability, and I imagine doesn't have like particularly great like information mental hacks defenses, would probably be very susceptible to this form of attack. And it's something that is very different from Gojo's regular sort of abilities. Now, it's something that you can we'll get into whether or not he brings it out at the start of the fight, because we've seen both. We've seen him hold off until he's trying to show Yuji something, but we've also seen him basically start off a fight like that when you look at Gojo versus Sukuna. It really depends on his mindset and how seriously he is taking the fighter. But that is kind of the general rundown on Gojo's abilities and how that's going to stack up, you know, given the context of Johnny and Gojo.
I 100% agree with most of the stuff there involving Johnny. Infinity and just the domain expansion itself would fry Johnny. I'm just going to clarify that off the bat. That is one major win con that Gojo has over Tusk Act 4. For the most part, most JoJo characters can't deal with that ability. I'm just going to outright state it. However, if this was Funny Valentine versus Gojo, that might be a different discussion. But that's not this discussion for this. We're dealing with the protagonist here, not the antagonist. Johnny with Act 2 versus Gojo basically is a a nothing fight. Tusk Act 2 wouldn't be able to get past any of Gojo's abilities. Gojo would be able to easily use purple, his domain expansion, his arguably better stats overall just to clip Johnny if he had his legs or horse in this fight. Also, I'll probably put this at the beginning of the video. This is a part 7 Johnny that knows how to use his feet thanks to the infinite rotation and the spin. But even if that was the case, I don't think this is a really massive discussion point. I think most of the audience should know this by now. However, this is where we have to get into the physics. Both of these characters are super mathematically based. It's actually really crazy how both authors really kind of delve deep into the mathematical bag while scaling these characters for these verses. And the thing with Act 3 is, it's stated in the manga Against Civil War, thanks to Gyro, that Act 3's power, its ability that Johnny is showing off to the world, is that it's above anything the Zeppeli family, the guys who made the spin, have ever used. It basically transcends them all. Johnny, within the few months he has learned the ability, has basically surpassed hundreds of years of practice and teaching and learning that has been passed down to the Zeppeli family. And this ability allows him to basically place himself within a bullet hole, which is stated to be a place in between worlds. It has also been described as a wormhole. Now, if the case is true where Act 3 has similarities to a wormhole, then we have to talk about a little bit of physics here. How wormholes work is once it grabs two spaces and folds them on top of each other, instantaneous travel can be achieved. If true, that possibly means Johnny and his Act 3 can get through Gojo's barrier. I think maybe, but that's going off some pretty crazy assumptions. Now, this is where I want you to chime in and be like, how do you feel about that? And I also will like to add to here before that, Act 3 doesn't have a lot of feats. This is basically just statements being said by Gyro, but Gyro is extremely knowledgeable with the spin. He's basically the greatest person, aside from Johnny, that knows how to use the ability.
Yeah, so I will just say, based on it being like a wormhole, it would kind of fall under like basic spatial manipulation. And then the question that you would need to answer is just like, is Tusk Act 3's output as a spatial manipulating ability strong enough to overcome the infinity? Like, so for example, right, there are other abilities that manipulate space in JJK that we've seen. Like, for example, Uro is someone that has sky manipulation, in which she's like literally dragging the literal sky, the space between people that you can see, in order to camouflage herself, in order to, you know, warp attacks away from her, etc, etc, etc. However, just because it's space manipulation doesn't necessarily mean that it's overcoming Gojo's abilities and his output, not only because of the amount of energy that is put behind infinity, but also because of the extent to which the thing that he's bringing to reality exists on, right? So there are some abilities, as I've outlined, like Sukuna's, which does cut kind of like, it's able to at least cut the world, space, and quote existence itself, right? And the question would just be, does Tusk Act 3 kind of meet the requirements for that? Now, I am seeing what I presume to be, I'll send it to you right now, is an official statement, probably like a volume extra about like the different Tusks, where it says that Tusk Act 3 is something that perhaps allows him to hide in the boundaries between different dimensions, right? Now, if the argument here is that this allows him to spiral into an infinitely small area, then he would be able to penetrate infinity, for the simple reason that, like, we know a couple of things, right? Gojo's abilities works on anything as small as an atom, but it's not stated or shown to work on anything smaller. Subatomic particles are not infinitely small. Johnny's ability, specifically Tusk Act 3, allows him to peer in infinitely small areas or even manipulate them for himself. Therefore, the infinitely small ability that he's using would sort of allow him to bypass infinity. Now, the main problem that you'd want to address is, and this is something that's kind of a bigger problem at large, is whether or not Gojo kind of like sits there, folds his arms, twiddles his thumbs, and is like, all right, hit me with your best shot. It's something you can certainly make the argument for. I mean, we've seen Gojo allow attacks to hit him, or allow attacks to hit infinity rather. The only thing to sort of concern yourself with is whether or not Gojo would look at Johnny and perceive a threat. Based on all the physical stats that you've detailed, he probably wouldn't all that much, in which case he's going to get hit. And it doesn't seem to be like an instantaneous death if he's noticing like, oh my god, my perfect defense is not really defending the way I need it to. He could then probably take action, and with the statistical difference, assumably like beat Johnny up and then maybe die from the spiraling infinitely into non-existence. However, on principle, I don't think it's very insane to say that Tusk Act 3 would probably work. Now, there is a specific defense, or rather a specific counter counter Gojo could apply that I think would honestly apply more for Tusk Act 4 than 3, simply because I don't know if Gojo's eyes would be able to perceive of the scale at which Johnny exists on at this level. Once again, given you take this volume statement hyper literally.
They're technically supposed to be taken at face value and are kind of assumed to be like Araki basically stating it, so it's like the author's rule is golden for the most part. But even if it did work, I still want to preface here with Gojo that Act 3 is pretty powerful, and I would agree that it would pass through the barrier in a multitude of ways, either through it infinitely spins to a point where the barrier just doesn't work anymore because it's infinitely smaller and goes through it, or it actually opens up a hole and Johnny is able to get through it. But the problem is Gojo's healing abilities and other stats would also play a massive factor here, so Johnny would have a problem for the most part. And I would also guess, since Gojo is an extremely good fighter, he's not going to touch the hole for whatever reason. That's like basic fighting 101. Civil War's user did it, but he was a dumbass. His ability basically required him to die. So no, I don't think that's a general use case. Everybody in fiction, I don't think Gojo would do that. This fight is interesting, but I think with just Act 3 alone, I would still give it to Gojo because of his other repertoires and like his use of abilities, etc., etc. I think he could get past Infinity, but I think I would give it to Gojo, at least here in this version of the discussion. Johnny doesn't have much. He's going to get either hit with an infinite amount of information or the other scaling is going to come into effect. And the only thing that Johnny can really do here is hide and use his bullets to maybe like slightly hurt Gojo, and then Gojo heals. So it's just going to be a massive back and forth until somebody majorly screws up.
For sure. And this is, based on my understanding at least, presuming Gojo sort of is beat to the punch, or out of arrogance lets Johnny make the first move. Because from my understanding, Gojo, to illustrate sort of maybe some generosity you're granting Johnny, right? If Johnny really is like pushing transonic, like he's a bullet timer, right? And like building your wall level, that's food for Gojo in a physical confrontation, you know, using blue, using red, using purple, whatever, right? So, and it's not, I won't even argue that it's necessarily in character for Gojo to go up and blitz and one-shot someone, because it's not necessarily, unless he's particularly upset or he has a reason to think that you're someone that's going to push him or press him a lot. But I just do want to make it known that, like, you know, in a world where Gojo looks at Johnny and says, now this guy's bad news, it's kind of over because of the relative stat difference. But I do think that going over their abilities act by act is pretty interesting. And it's also sort of the aspect that I think when people have this matchup in their head, that's really what they're talking about. It's a clash of abilities as much as it is the characters.
Now, for the JJK fans that don't know, Johnny is the type of character to use all of his power all at once off rip, thanks to the showings in Steel Ball Run. He has a very murderous attitude behind him. So it would be a character of a nonchalant attitude versus a guy who's ready to kill on sight. So both of these personalities do play a pretty major role here to who you think wins. This is the big one, and everybody's been waiting for it. So Act 4, in both of our opinions before recording, gets through Infinity easily. So once he's on the horse and he fires it off, an bullet with an infinite amount of power that is able to affect a person's body on an individual cellular level on all cells spins infinitely and kills them, and also affects the soul / other physical energies of said being. It's insane. It literally just dusts you from existence after a while, because depending on the case, it either instantly kills you or it's like slowly working on you, just like how it did with Valentine. It had the ability to pierce a barrier which had multiple infinities stacked on top of it. It could go through a different world, it can go through a different world at a different time, its own world at a different time, any point on the planet at a different time, and it still was able to rip open Love Train's barrier and easily defeat Funny Valentine. And we talked about this before. The infinite distance thing, while impressive for Gojo, in comparison to Tusk Act 4, everybody says it's a perfect counter. I'm gonna actually state how it actually is. In my opinion, infinitely worse than Love Train's, just because of how grand Love Train's ability is. Once it grabs Gojo's barrier, it's just gonna rip it open and just manhandle him. And on the chance it does actually miss for whatever reason, it does track. However, it does not track for friendly, so if Gojo is able to figure that out, it could also be a pretty pretty big threat for Johnny if he can't reverse it, and Johnny can reverse it by shooting another infinite spin in the opposite direction. Act 4's infinite rotation is ridiculously overpowered. However, I need to clarify this right now because everybody forgets about this point when coming up with this argument for Johnny. It does require a little bit of prep with the horse. If the horse is not healthy, if it's not running at a certain speed in sync with Johnny, or doesn't give its horse-like energy to Johnny to shoot out the infinite nail bullet at its opponent, it will not properly work and it will fail. It will lead to a very powerful bullet, but not an infinitely powerful bullet. So for whatever reason, if Gojo messes with it or Johnny messes up with it, it's going to be a problem for the guy. Once that happens, it falls back into the Act 3 discussion from there.
Yeah, so I'll step in here and offer like maybe a few potential things that Gojo could do to counter this, or, you know, things that I think would happen in character. So for one, if the generation of this power is something that is like stand based, like basically, you know, it's sort of like this spiritualistic energy, then Gojo Six Eyes might just pick up on what is essentially an infinity piercing bomb getting ready to run towards him at max speed. He might also even be able to literally see the link of energy between the horse and Johnny, in which case we know that when Gojo is fighting multiple opponents that contribute to being able to beat him, for example, Sukuna and Maharaga, he has no issue absolutely attempting to clobber the thing that is aiding it. And like in Johnny's case, he's not as strong as Sukuna, and in the horse's case, he's not Maharaga. So unfortunately for them, it won't necessarily result in the same thing. So I do think that there is a possibility of Gojo preventing Tusk Act 4 from having its infinitely attack potency punching power. However, I do agree that like being able to transcend dimensions and timelines is just something that like Infinity has never shown a defensive capacity to block. You could speculate till the cows come home, but it's just not a feat that Infinity has on its resume, right? Anything that's sort of like just pretty standard manipulation of space on a higher tier seems to be able to get past it. And as far as I'm concerned, Tusk Act 4 seems to fit the bill. So if Gojo's sitting there, hands in his pockets, you know, looking like a chill guy, just waiting for the attack to happen, then yeah, he's getting an infinitely powerful hole through his chest. Maybe you can make the argument that as he's deteriorating, he can spam RCT at max output to heal and then kill Johnny as well, so that it's kind of like a tie in the event that he gets hit. But I would essentially just argue that like upon getting hit, he loses or makes it a draw at best. However, I do think that there are options for him to avoid it and for him to get around it. Regardless, if you asked me to bet who is going to win based on sort of the context that we've laid out, I would say that Gojo just has the tools needed to sort of end it even in a casual fashion. Like if Johnny's shooting out Tusk Act 2 or 3 bullets and Gojo's like, oh, okay, that was crazy, red, it's kind of over because like Gojo doesn't have to be taking Johnny super seriously to like unironically blitz him in one shot. And like he could accidentally shoot out a blast that he would use on Jogo, and then Johnny's like, oh yeah, dude, I don't have like half of my body anymore. So it's one of those things to where Tusk Act 4, I will say, seems to be infinitely above Gojo's abilities as the Limitless. It's just paired with a character that is, in very rare fashion for a versus battle like this, statistically wholly inferior to Gojo.
Yeah, I'd also argue here for the fans that want to be like, wait, Meadows, what about the highball scaling? If we did say that Johnny is basically equivalent to Jotaro and all those abilities, all of a sudden now Johnny has the advantage in like AP durability being like near mountain level or even island level, depending if you want to go that high, and speed being equivalent to massively faster than light. Plus, there's still things in Gojo's kit that can affect Johnny, because even then, domain expansion kind of makes speed like useless, so it wouldn't matter there. And then the AP and durability stuff, even in this case of a domain expansion, mean nothing because infinite information into your brain. So even on a highball, I still think it's actually a discussion to have because of these abilities classing. It's still up in the air depending on how these abilities go. I still think for the most part, the Act 3 discussion is a lot more interesting to go into, because if Act 4 is shot out, even if the horse afterwards gets hurt or something, and it still tracks onto Gojo, it's basically game over. The moment the bullet leaves his finger, it's maybe, depending on Gojo and what he does in the moment, life or death. Like it's either or. You either live and run away or you die. That's basically the end of the discussion with that if it leaves his fingertips. If it's not that case, I do think it goes in Gojo's favor, but it really is like the ultimate counter to Gojo.
I think for Gojo, the win conditions are honestly more abundant than like his ability to lose. You could physically argue that Gojo is just blue enhancing his punches and just like genuinely boxing Johnny up. You can argue that like a red that he uses would be enough. Hell, a hollow purple would actually send him to heaven. And obviously, as we've explained here, a domain expansion would be enough. Now, assuming that Johnny does outstat Gojo, you kind of push him to a point where Infinity isn't as effective with like the higher tier abilities like Tusk Act 4, and then like his general stats wouldn't be enough to overwhelm him. A domain expansion does sort of equalize those things a little bit. I'm assuming no JoJo's character has ever really come across an ability like that. And even if they have, you know, you just hear domain expansion, you see some dude with white hair cross his fingers, and then you're just brain dead. It's one of those things that you don't necessarily have a particularly good counter for. Now, I will say this, in the event that Johnny outstats Gojo, I'm giving it to Johnny more often than not. But in the event of like what we've been talking about for a majority of this video, Johnny's stats are a lot lower, I will give it to Gojo more often than not. I don't want it to be misconstrued. Tusk Act 4 over the Limitless in terms of abilities. However, in an overall fight, I do have Gojo over Johnny given the circumstances that we've discussed here.
I think it just depends. It's almost very cowboy-like, going back to the Steel Ball Run thematics. It's whoever draws first almost.
Yeah, a nice Western, you know, a nice little quick draw, you know, high noon, Gojo versus Johnny.
So I think with that all being said, thank you, Ronin, for being here. I've been waiting to do this video for a very long time. Any final words?
No, man, I appreciate you having me, man. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
Yes. Next time we'll do, I don't know, Maki versus Jolene. That might be a fun matchup. It actually might be kind of even. But
maybe. We'll have to see.
So with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me and Ronin on Twitter. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Deuces.